Good evening, and welcome to the keynote address of the 56th Institute on Ethics in Journalism. My name is Art Brisbane, and I'm serving this year as the visiting Knight Professor of Ethics in Journalism. Before I introduce our speaker, Dean Baquet of the New York Times, I'd like to recognize and thank the other professionals who've been kind enough to join us for this weekend's seminar as fellows. These journalists are engaged with my journalism ethics students in a free-flowing discussion of selected cases that pose important questions about how journalists do their work. Fellows, I'm going to ask you to stand as I introduce you and remain standing until all have been named. And for the rest of you in the audience, please hold your applause, and I'll give you the go-ahead when the time is right. Alicia Budich. Please stand, Alicia, wherever you are. Here she comes. What an entrance. She's W&L class of 2011, and she is a CBS News Capitol Hill producer, so she's used to spectacular entrances and exit, I'm sure. You have to stand, Alicia. That's part of the deal. Thank you. Okay, next is Miriam Pepper, a longtime colleague of mine, in days gone by, who is the editorial page editor of the Kansas City Star. Next is Stephanie Hardiman-Simon, also an alum, WNL. You have to stand, Stephanie. She's the coordinator of social media, daily blogs, and civic engagement for the Better Government Association, which is a nonprofit investigative news organization in Chicago. Kevin Finch. Kevin is a colleague on faculty, also a visiting professor this year, visiting assistant professor, former television news director in Indianapolis and elsewhere. Nathan Hager is with us. He's in 1999 in the back, Nathan. WNL alumnus. He's a morning anchor in All News 99.1 WNEW radio in Washington, D.C. And finally, Rick Thames, the executive editor of the Charlotte Observer. Please help me thank these people for coming. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to introduce each of them, but I would like to have the students in this year's journalism ethics class please stand and be recognized. They're all in the front row. They really know how to do it. I would also like to take a moment and thank Joan Millen. Joan, you need to stand here because Joan is the Knight program assistant and has put this entire event together. So thank you, Joan. Great job. And I would like to acknowledge the support provided by the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, whose generosity makes the Knight Ethics program here possible, along with a great many other programs nationally in journalism. And now on to our program. The discussion today is timely because clearly journalism is at a crossroads. We've all read about the dramatic changes wrought by digital technology, and some of us have actually lived through it. The changes have been dramatic in the way news is produced, the way we consume it, in the economics of news, and in the culture at large. These transformational changes have imposed real pressures on the basic value system that professional journalists have come to embrace. The pressure to break news instantly, the rise of so-called citizen journalists, unbound by codes of conduct, new challenges to the separation of news and advertising, a rising congress of opinion journalists. These are just a few of the trend lines that are changing journalism at a rapid clip. With all that change, it's more important than ever that journalists, those who aspire to a professional standard of conduct, strengthen their commitment to making ethical standards, making ethical choices. So we're extremely fortunate today to have with us someone who mans the controls at the epicenter of this transformational storm. As the managing editor of the New York Times, Dean Baquet is one to whom readers look to sustain the Times' position as the leading news organization in America, and possibly in the world. And yet a news organization that is hardly immune to the powerful pressures brought on by the digital revolution. As managing editor, Dean shapes the daily report and assists the executive editor, Jill Abramson, in mapping a strategic path for the Times' journalism. And he reached his position the old-fashioned way, working his way up from a job at his hometown paper, the New Orleans Times-Picayune, straight out of college. Covering cops, courts, and City Hall, Dean got a great education in the kind of journalism practiced so well by his next paper, the Chicago Tribune. Indeed, his years at the Tribune culminated in the 1988 Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting, which a team led by Dean won for its coverage of corruption in the Chicago City Hall. Dean refined his skills next at the New York Times, working as a reporter and editor through the 1990s, before getting an offer to join one of America's top editors, John S. Carroll, in recharging the batteries of the Los Angeles Times. Together, John Carroll and Dean, who served as Carroll's managing editor, over the next 7 years reeled in 13 Pulitzer Prizes. In that time, Dean emerged as what we in the trade like to call a reporter's editor. That's an editor the reporters actually like. He was to be tested in that capacity after taking on the top job in LA, following John Carroll's retirement. In late 2006, the LA Times' parent, the Tribune Company, was pressuring Dean and the paper's publisher, Jeffrey Johnson, to make staff cuts, all part of a continuing stream of forced adaptations to the troubled economics of journalism. But Dean and Johnson just said no to corporate, believing the cuts would damage the paper's news product, and both were in turn forced out. For Dean, I'm sure it was a disappointing outcome in Los Angeles, but it illuminated a path back east, where he was quickly installed as the New York Times' Washington bureau chief, and from there it was a straight shot to the managing editor's chair in 2011. I had the good fortune to meet Dean during this period while I was serving as the paper's public editor, a kind of ombudsman position. My job was to give Dean as hard a time as possible. I found him to be a robust defender of his reporters, of their work, a diligent editor, and most important to me, someone who enjoyed the give and take of debate over the daily grist of journalistic work. After his remarks, Dean will take questions. Please join me in welcoming Dean Baquet.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. Good. First off, I'd like to thank Washington and Lee for inviting me today. The news game is not particularly contemplative. We don't have a lot of time. And exercises like this one, just thinking about what I wanted to say, forces me to stop and think about a profession that I care a whole lot about. I'd particularly like to thank Art, who was polite in describing our give and take, which was often, as he would say, tense. But I have to say that in our heart of hearts, we know that having a public editor makes us better. And I have to say that Art in particular handled the job with great style and a great sense of journalistic mission and integrity. And when he left, the paper was better for it. Usually, I didn't mean for I mean, he left behind a better paper. Usually when I speak on college campuses, I like to talk about the great joys and pleasures of journalism and why those of you who want to pursue a career in journalism should blow off the naysayers and jump into the waters. I have every intention of doing that. These are the greatest jobs in the world, and your generation will oversee the transformation of journalism while I hope holding on to the most important things. But first, I want to provoke you. This is a gathering on ethics, after all. With a journalism subject that is discussed a lot, but maybe not from the perspective I'd like to offer and argue. I come before you in praise of anonymous sources. Why they matter, why we shouldn't cut back on them so much, why we shouldn't fear them so much, why we should even defend their use, use them the right way, and maybe do it more often. The mere mention of anonymous sources these days conjures up dark images of manipulative government officials lording it over lily-livered or overly ambitious reporters out for the scoop. Anonymice, they're called. Critics insist it's time to curb them. And of course we use them too often. It would be silly of me to say otherwise. Of course we should try harder not to let them take cheap shots while hiding behind the phrase officials say. But stop for a minute. Here is what you would not know were it not for anonymous sources. You would not know that the NSA illegally spied on Americans and that the office of the Vice President of the United States tried to keep it secret. It was a disclosure by reporters Jim Risen and Eric Lichbaugh that first moved NSA spying into the public mind, long before anyone heard of Edward Snowden. You would not know, unbelievably, that the CIA has for years waged a secret, undeclared war in the tribal areas of Pakistan. President Obama said recently that it was perhaps time to debate the subject, the use of drones in Pakistan. But you wouldn't even know that that war existed. The government's never confirmed it, let alone that it was worthy of debate. Were it not for the military officials, intelligence operatives, and even White House higher-ups who broke the rules and talked about it in secret phone calls and meetings with journalists. You would not know that the CIA destroyed evidence of torture were it not for anonymous sources who described it and helped launch an investigation. You would not know about the Black Room in Baghdad, where Special Forces operatives brutalized their prisoners in the days after the fall of Saddam Hussein, were it not for some brave sources who thought it was worth risking their careers to let the public know. We would not know about the internal divisions within the Obama administration over intervening in Syria, or how deeply to engage in Afghanistan, were it not for the officials who felt it important for the public to know that they opposed the White House. Of course we make mistakes. In fact, that's sort of an understatement. We move so quickly that it is easy to slip in a highly competitive world where officials routinely traffic in secret information and journalists compete ferociously to get the story first. Max Frankel, a former editor of the paper, once offered a terrific description of the world of courting sources in Washington. He called it a cooperative, competitive, antagonistic, and arcane relationship. He added that it, quote, mystifies even experienced professionals in many fields, including those with government experience, and including the most astute politicians and attorneys. Our anonymous sources led to one of our greatest failures, the bad reporting in the pre-war buildup before the Iraq War. We forgot, sadly, that the best use of anonymous sources is to challenge the government, not to let the government hide behind the weaknesses of its arguments, or to use anonymity to tell lies or to slander. But also remember that the stories that corrected the record, the stories about abuse of power, the stories that showed how the government exaggerated its evidence also often came from anonymous sources. The problem is not anonymous sources. That's a technical debate about craft that's been elevated far, far beyond its import, to the point that the real issue is missing. We screw up when we stop being aggressive watchdogs, not when we grant anonymity. Knight Ridder, which famously asked hard questions before the war, didn't pull that off because it did or didn't use anonymous sources. It did it because it remembered that its role was to be the questioning outsider. If we are going to have a debate here over the use of anonymous sources, and of course we should have that debate, my main goal is to draw a clear distinction between what I call ritualized anonymous sources, the aides to congressmen who only want their member named, or the agreed-upon senior official who speaks anonymously to a room filled with reporters and who is just trying to spin us, versus the anonymous sources who are taking risks that are crucial to journalism's role in a democracy, which is holding power to account. That class of sources, that vital class of sources, is growing as the Obama administration pursues its relentless clampdown on leaks. There are at least 7 criminal investigations of leaks that we know of, more than all previous administrations put together. And it seems literally that every time we break a new story, another investigation is open. In this atmosphere, whether we like it or not, we will need anonymous sources as never before. And we need to assure them that the anonymity will stick. An increasingly difficult deal to keep with a White House and a Justice Department declaring war on the free flow of information. And in a world in which one of our best investigative reporters at the Times, Jim Risen, is knocking on the door of going to prison for protecting an anonymous source. The use of anonymous sources will continue to increase. The war on terror, by its very nature, is a secret one, with secret combatants. So much of the government's work, in fact, is done in secret, and the only way to describe it to the world is by talking to people who risk their careers and nowadays possibly even risk imprisonment for talking. We do, of course, have to face up to the fact that the unbridled use of anonymous sources does great harm to our credibility. Our burden is to grant anonymity out of necessity, not out of convenience. But you will see these sources more and more, and my only plea is that you don't cringe, but rather remember what you would not know if they did not exist: the undeclared war, the government mishaps, and the increasing power of an intelligence community with tremendous access, almost unbelievable access to technology that can ferret out the smallest bits of information about us. Having admitted to some of our weaknesses, I hope you'll indulge me for a few minutes to now defend big journalism, since I took the unusual step of defending anonymous sources. This is an ethics group, right? So you want a little bit of ambiguity here, right? Over the past few years, 2 of the biggest stories involving national security have been broken by independent operators: WikiLeaks and the NSA leak by Edward Snowden. They have made people question just how much they need the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, Knight Ridder, Der Spiegel, and the other giant newspaper operations. But having been deeply involved in those myself, I can promise you that none of these stories would have had the impact. In fact, some of them wouldn't have even been possible without these lumbering, old-fashioned news organizations. If you've seen the WikiLeaks movie, and I gather not many people have seen the WikiLeaks movie, or if you've paid attention to the travails of Julian Assange, you know the bare outlines of the story. Assange obtained thousands of cables from Chelsea Manning and made them public. Here's what you may not know. I sent an email a couple days ago to the first person at the Times who went through the WikiLeaks cables to describe to me what he saw when we first asked him to look at them. Quote, "It was just a big pile of stuff," recalled Andy Laring, the computer reporter assigned to make sense of it all for the Times. The dross of unclassified cables, often recounting the day's headlines in a particular capital, was all mixed in with confidential, secret, important cables laying out behind-the-scenes maneuvering against Iran's nuclear program or Chinese cyber attacks. So for weeks, a team of reporters at 3 major newspapers, people who had covered wars, reporters who had spent careers bouncing from one world capital to the next, reporters who had made mistakes in the pre-war buildup in Iraq, sifted through hundreds of thousands of documents and yanked out dozens of stories. The same is true of the Snowden affair. I've spent hours myself looking at the information that Snowden provided. Somebody said that when you go through it and try to piece together a story, it's like trying to write a profile of somebody by reading the emails of the tech person at their office. Reporters for The Guardian, Der Spiegel, The Post, and The Times painstakingly pored over incoherent documents to make sense of the NSA's giant spying apparatus. I don't think, in fact, I can promise you, these documents would not have been fully exploited were it not for the fearlessness and determination of those newspapers, first of all, The Guardian. Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, the original journalists, had an important story to tell. But I hope they would acknowledge that they needed people like James Ball, the lead reporter from The Guardian, and the courage of his editors for facing up to a belligerent British government. Now I'll turn to the speech I usually give, or a version of, when I come to college campuses, because it's equally important to me. I'd like to close the way that I always close. I'd like to offer my case for the practice of journalism, the joy of craft, and some advice to those of you who want to be journalists. A little bit about myself. I learned to report by trial and error. In fact, by covering trials and making errors. As a young reporter in Louisiana, I hyped a story onto the front page. Or rather, I was ambitious, and I let a bad editor convince me to hype a story. I was covering a rape trial, and the defendant was no doubt guilty. He was an actor who lured women to his apartment with promises of movie roles, then he assaulted them. Prodded by my editor, I described him as a two-bit actor. I filled the story with the kind of hyperbole that you now see on horrible crime reporting shows and in places like BuzzFeed. I'm probably not supposed to say that, but I'll say it. The next day, I showed up for the second day of the trial. The defendant looked at me, beaten. His lawyer just shook his head. Even the prosecutor, who should have been happy that I pilloried the guy, looked at me with a little bit less respect. I had learned a lesson because I had to face the people that I wrote about. That's not a lesson that I would have learned opining at home. So for those of you who want to be journalists, and I'm not afraid to use that highfalutin term, the journalists captured in Syria deserve it. My friend David Kirkpatrick, who risks his life in the Middle East, deserves it. For you all, I have some advice. First, take the job that will let you learn to report. Reporting is more important than analysis. Without reporting, it's just guesswork. It's what bad reporters do. Second, learn history. Read about how the meetings in Paris in 1919 helped to shape the world, especially the world we live in now. How the South came to be what it is today, how a bill becomes the law, how the discussions between Pakistan and India have shaped the modern world. Third, understand the difference between building a career and honing a craft. Young reporters always ask me whether they should take one job or another. I always say, take the job that will teach you something you don't know, that will take you to a place you've never been. Fourth, read, 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 and never stop reading. There's much to learn in history. At the height of the war in Afghanistan, one Thanksgiving when I was editor of the Los Angeles Times, I sent a note to the great Pulitzer Prize winner David Zucchino, who was in the mountains with the U.S. military in Afghanistan, asking him what I should read to try to get some understanding of what he was seeing. I had this picture of this reporter I deeply cared about, who was not only in a dangerous place, but a place that I couldn't see, and I wanted to see the world through his eyes. I was expecting him to send me a note suggesting some tome on the history of Afghanistan. Instead, he recommended a story that was not even about Afghanistan. He told me that I should read Haji Murat by Tolstoy, a long short story that was set in the Caucasus in the 1800s. It's the story of a proud warlord, and it remains the most illuminating thing I've read about Afghanistan, even though I've now been there. Finally, don't get so caught up in your ambitions and aspirations that you miss the process of becoming a journalist. The process, the years of work, of study, of going to a place with your eyes open, asking questions, is the true joy of journalism. I grew up in Louisiana. My mother had a third-grade education. There were no books in my house. I'd never been on an airplane until I went off to college. Newspapers have allowed me to see the world. And to those of you who become journalists, you're entering the profession at a wonderful time. And you're going to get to recreate it at a time when it is more valuable than ever. Thank you very much. Questions about anything? Yes?
This fall,
I'm going to repeat the question when the person asks, just so everyone can hear it. Go ahead.
this fall we had a journalist that came and spoke to the community about the breaking story in Benghazi, Laura Logan. And it has just come out that her source was bogus. What advice would you give to aspiring journalists today about their sources?
In a case, I'll repeat the question. He said that Laura Logan, I gather, came to the campus to talk about coverage of Benghazi, where the American ambassador was killed in Libya. And it has just come out that they're going to have to reinvestigate their story because their primary source, the one they put on the air, turns out to, reading between the lines, to have lied about his story, to have exaggerated his story of climbing the wall, fighting off an insurgent, and going to the side of the American ambassador. I don't want to, it's always tricky to re-edit somebody else's story, but my advice, and knock on wood, the reason I've never edited a story or been involved in a story where we had to backtrack that much, I can't imagine that you would have put that story on the air without doing a more thorough investigation of the person. I really can't. I mean, he had given 3 accounts, one to Laura Logan and in his book that he wrote about the case. So he had a self-interest. He'd given another account to the FBI that was contrary to that, and then he gave him another account to his bosses that was contrary to that. I think that in a year-long investigation or whatever that she conducted or her producers conducted, I like to think, knock on wood, I like to think that I would have reported like hell to learn any, if I'd known that the person gave an account to the FBI, I at least would have gone to the FBI and said, come on, give me a hand here, tell me if, so I mean, I think they would even admit that it was sloppy reporting. You should always understand, but here's my advice. You should always understand the motivations of your sources. That doesn't mean that you won't use the information, but you should always understand the motivation because it'll help you gauge the truth of it. And you should even try your best to give people, even if you can't name them, a sense of their motivations in the story. I mean, for instance, I described the stories, the debates inside the Obama White House about what role the military should play in Syria. I think it's important that people should know that some of the main opposition was the military. And we've said that in the stories. It's important for people to know their motives. Their motive is that the military doesn't believe in wars with undetermined outcomes. And we tried to make that clear in the stories. It didn't make what they had to say less true, but you got to know as much as you can about your sources. That's vital. And their motivations. More stuff. Front? Yes.
You talked about understanding your sources' motivations. So what is the New York Times verification process for anonymous sources? How do you go about vetting those sources?
Well, you can't, I mean, it's two things. First off, I don't publish a sensitive story. We don't publish a sensitive story without the reporter telling me who the source is. And without me grilling the reporter a little bit about the source, the motivation of the source. In fact, when we make mistakes, it's when we move too fast and don't do that. You have to ask them the questions, and you have, as the editor's job is to look at everything with a little bit of skepticism. So that's the only way to do it. But the other thing to keep in mind is most anonymous sources don't come out of the woodwork. They are people who've dealt with reporters for a long time, which means their veracity has been tested. Reporters know them. So the reporter will say to me something like, now, this is the same person who confirmed that other story last week and that other story last week. So that's the most you can do. Yes?
You spoke about understanding sources' motivations. In the context of the Watergate scandal, there was some speculation that Mark Felt, one of the reasons why Mark Felt did what he did was because he had some kind of grudge against Nixon for not naming him the director of the FBI. Knowing what we know now, do you think maybe there could have been some sort of different, I don't want to say different outcome, but something different if that was more prominent in the whole thing?
Repeat the question.
I'm sorry, I wasn't repeating the question. His question was, given that I said you have to know something about the motivation of sources, it's now come out that Mark Felt, who was a former very high-ranking official in the FBI, was deep throat. Felt admitted it himself, and then Woodward confirmed it. And that one of Felt's motivations, some people believe, is that he didn't continue to get promotions and may have had some anger at the administration. And the question is, would there have been more, if the world knew that, is that the fair question, would that have, yeah, that's a tricky one, because the other thing you have to do with this anonymous source story is you have to weigh the story versus granting the person anonymity versus how you deal with their motivation. I mean, if Mark Felt was the source for these, stories about how the Clintons had tense relations with, their Secret Service, that would have been an important factor. But in this case, I would argue, the Watergate scandal was so huge that his motivation was ranked 25th on the scale of importance of story versus motivation of source. You always have to do that balancing act. You have to always say, I mean, the right way to make that measure is, okay, do I give this person anonymity? Is the story worth it? I lose a little bit of credibility when I quote an anonymous source. Is this one worth it? I think that one was worth it. Yes?
You mentioned the Obama administration is sort of making an unprecedented drive to clamp down and to nail people who talk to the press anonymously. Who is driving that, do you think, within the administration? Is it Eric Holder?
No, we actually did I actually had a group of reporters take I'll repeat the question, I'm sorry, I keep forgetting. The question was, I said that the Obama administration is more zealously going after leak investigations and anonymous sources than any previous administration. And the gentleman's question was, who's driving it? Is it Eric Holder? We actually spent a long time trying to understand who was driving it and wrote a long story about it. I think it's being driven by the intelligence community. And I think that Holder has grabbed hold of it, but I think that the intelligence community is driving it. In their defense, by the way, this goes back to something I said earlier, there's more secret stuff now than there has ever been in American history. There just is. I mean, it's the rise of technology's ability to do so much stuff. It used to be if you wanted to spy on a head of state, think what that meant. It meant you had to break into the office, hide a wire, pray that nobody caught the wire, listen to the conversations, from a van parked down the street, pray that nobody saw the van. Today, monitoring anybody's conversation is such an easy matter. So there's much, much more secrecy, much more done in secret, which means we use anonymous sources more, and it makes them nuts. It also means that the intelligence communities are much more powerful than they've ever been. The CIA is a transformed institution. It's now half a military institution. It's running a war on its own. Tony?
Given what you said about technology and all of the NSA revelations, not all anonymous sources are as sophisticated, anywhere near as sophisticated as Edward Snowden in terms of his knowledge of technology. What are reporters at the New York Times doing to protect anonymous sources who aren't as sophisticated as Edward Snowden?
It's difficult. We're doing things that we haven't done in 20 years. We're asking people to meet us in parks. We're asking people to meet us in restaurants. There are reporters who, we ran a story 3 days ago by Charlie Savage in the Washington Bureau, and it's about how the CIA pays AT&T to. That was not it was a front page story. It was not a blockbuster story. It was not in the realm of the biggest Snowden stuff. But Charlie wouldn't email me the story. We had to have an encrypted system for him to send me the story. We couldn't even figure out how to get the damn thing on the copy desk. Reporters are really paranoid. They don't want to talk on the phone. I go to Washington. His editor comes to New York to meet with me. But mainly, we do much more face-to-face. We're working with The Guardian on stories, and when we want to talk to them, we go to their offices in Soho, or they come to our offices in Times Square. The first conversation we had with them, we flew out to London to meet with them to talk about how we would work together. There's tremendous paranoia among reporters. I mean, remember that we now have, at least two, in my case, two New York Times reporters whose stories are under investigation, Jim Risen and David Sanger. That doesn't account the AP reporter, the Fox News reporter. So people are truly paranoid, with reason. We do using some report. I don't know how to use. I can barely sign on, but people use encryption and tell me about it. So. More stuff all the way in the back.
Congratulations on reaching 10 million followers on Twitter. I would like you to comment on that. What does that mean?
That the New York Times has 10 million followers on Twitter. Yes. So if she congratulated us, I have never, and I'm ashamed to admit this, and the people who run our Twitter operation, I have followers, but I've never actually done it myself, which is partly a testament to my age, but partly a testament to how busy I am. I think it's terrific. I mean, I think the New York Times is availing itself of every possible way to get news out. I think that's what we're supposed to do, and I think that. I mean, if Nick Kristof, for instance, I've seen the numbers, who's one of our opinion columnists, if he was a news organization himself, he would be like 5th or 6th in the world in terms of Twitter followers. So it's huge. It's anything we can do to get news out in an era when we want to reach as many people as possible is terrific. So, yes. Well, the question was, how do I see big news organizations moving into the market where people may prefer free content, right? Was that fair? For ad-based. I mean, we made a decision, the New York Times made a decision that not every news organization can make to not be free. I mean, we made a decision to charge people for the website, and it's been successful. To our relief, people have been willing to pay for it. Not every paper can do that, I think. Some papers, to be perfectly frank, have cut themselves so much that they're left with news that a lot of people have. Some papers don't do it for philosophical reasons. My friends at The Guardian are free. My view, we have the most expensive print newsroom around. And the only way we can deliver big foreign coverage, the only way we can be all the places we are, the only way we can try to cover all the things we cover, it costs a lot of money. And I think that free wouldn't allow us to do that. I think if we were free, we would be a diminished news operation. We just wouldn't have the people to do it. And I think people recognize that because they're willing to pay, and our audience online continues to grow significantly. Yes?
Just going back to social media for a minute, what's your opinion on using social media as a source for information?
I think we use social media on, especially on big run-in stories, constantly. No, I think social media is a tremendous source. The question was my view of, my view of using social media as a source. Journalistically, I'm actually more excited about social media as a potential way to develop sources and learn things as I am about social media reaching an audience, only because my perverse journalism mindset is I want to find as much stuff out as I can. No, and we use it constantly. Yes?
You talked about using anonymous sources who are people that you've worked with in the past and you know about them. What about with breaking news? Is there a different way you handle anonymous sources?
Yeah, the question is, I talked about using anonymous sources that most, like Mark Mazzetti, who covers the CIA better than anybody in the country, to my mind, has a body of sources he trusts. So the question is, what about using anonymous sources in breaking news? The bar is higher because hardly ever are they going to be people you know. So you need even more sources. You don't know them. You don't know what they claim to have seen. All that said, I think there are instances in which, you show up after a school shooting and there are going to be cops on the scene, families who don't want their names in a newspaper talking about a tragedy. I think in those cases, you try particularly hard to not have to use anonymous sources. And you should really only use them for important information that's important enough so that when people read your story, they're not wondering who all those people are. So the bar is higher because it's not usually highly consequential information that can only be obtained from secret sources. So I think the bar's got to be higher. All right, sure.
Bill Keller wrote this interesting piece, which was a dialogue between him and Glenn Greenwald.
Mm-hmm.
And it became a dialogue about the virtues, on the one hand, of impartial journalism, and on the other hand, Glenn Greenwald's advocacy of advocacy journalism. I wonder what you think about that dichotomy. Do you think that the world of advocacy journalism, which seems to be growing, is likely to swamp and become preeminent in relation to the more traditional world of impartial journalism?
Art's question was, using Glenn Greenwald as an example, who by his account is an advocacy journalist, is it possible that the world of advocacy journalists will ultimately swamp the world of so-called objective journalists who try not to state a point of view? I don't think so, actually. I think there've always been advocacy journalists. I mean, it's interesting how, not you, but it's interesting how the public's memory is short. I mean, I.F. Stone was a acclaimed advocacy journalist. Seymour Hersh, in moments in his career, has been an advocacy journalist. So I actually don't have any issues with advocacy journalists. I think they're journalists. I do think that they have some things missing that big newspapers that strive to be objective can fill in the blanks for. I don't think, to be perfectly honest, and he would challenge me, but I will say it anyway, I don't think Glenn Greenwald can make as much sense of a batch of national security documents as I can, or my colleagues at the New York Times, or reporters at The Guardian can make. I think Glenn is looking for, and Glenn is, I have all the respect in the world for Glenn Greenwald, but Glenn is looking, because he's such a powerful advocate, he is looking for stuff that supports his point of view. He just is. He would, I can't imagine he would even deny that. I am looking for stuff that's just stories. I'm looking through the Iran stuff to understand the relationship between the West and Iran. Glenn is looking for it to support his point of view about foreign policy, the press, and et cetera. So I think we're different. I don't think you can do without us. I also don't think, and I think Glenn is honest and has not broken anything. He's actually been very careful, the stuff he's broken. I have respect for him. But I do think that objectively you have to be able to believe. If a major news organization writes an account of a document in the NSA files, I promise you it will be more objective and more accurate than Glenn's, because Glenn is looking for something and we're just looking for a story. So that would be my view. And I think the public, I think, you know, we all get caught up in the, only about 15 to 20% of journalism falls into this category of controversial stuff that we all wrestle with and shake our hands about and wonder what Glenn would do versus what the New York Times would do. The truth is 75% of what's in the paper is like just the fact stuff, right? It's like, how much did the Twitter IPO get yesterday? It's who's up in the Heisman Trophy balloting. So there's a whole lot of stuff we do that's not controversial that I think people also want us to do. Yes?
Do you think there's some tactics that journalists have not tried to tamp down the number of off-the-record or anonymous sources from government officials?
Yeah.
And I have a little ethics case here. The Association of Opinion Journalists has a one-day State Department briefing, and we ask that it be on the record. And these are regional papers who come. And this past year, State Department went off the record innumerable times and caused a big ruckus. Do we go back again, press the issue more to be on the record? Do we not have it because we're protesting this?
The question was, have we used enough tactics? Have we tried hard enough to push particularly big government agencies to be on the record? And in your case, you've described editors from regional papers going before the State Department, which tried to put everything off the record. There's a lot more we can do. I, for instance, do not go to White House. I was the Washington bureau chief for the New York Times for 5 or 6 years, 6 years. I never, ever met Barack Obama. I never went to any of the, you know, arguably the bureau chief of the New York Times is one of the people that they would want to include. I refused to go to briefings with the president that were off the record. I just thought that's not, if I'm going to send a signal, at least I'll do that. So I didn't go to the White House Christmas party either for the same reason. Most bureau chiefs do go, but I didn't go. I do think there are more things like that we can do to push back. It's hard, because sometimes, I mean, I keep mentioning the way the web has changed things and enforces deadlines, and also the sheer competition. If you stand up and say, I'm leaving the State Department briefing because it's ridiculous that it's off the record, and you walk away, if you look around, half of your colleagues will have stayed. And then you got to ask a tough question, right? My view is you should keep walking. On the other hand, your readers are going to get something less than their readers. So it's not as easy as it, there's much more, and that's the ritualistic anonymous sources that I talked about in Washington, which I hate. But I think it's harder to wean yourself off of it than you think. You'd have to get everybody else to go along. But we should try harder. We really should. Yes, in the back. The question was, what's the most difficult ethical dilemma I have faced in my career in journalism. That's actually an easy one because it comes up a lot. The hardest decisions, because of my job as Washington bureau chief and because now as managing editor, I oversee a lot of our national security coverage. The hardest decisions I have to make are when to publish a story when the government insists that something bad will happen if we publish it. Those are the by far the hardest decisions. It's because it used to be, when I was at the LA Times, I think I got a call like that twice. Once from George Tenet, and once from somebody when he was the CIA director. But I would say that's the hardest one. And they go like this. I mean, this is the standard call. And I would say they used to be infrequent. I probably, over the last 2 months, have had 10. And they go like this. If you publish that particular document, that operation described in the document will be shut down. And if we lose that capability, if you disclose that capability and we lose it, it will make it harder for us to monitor a set group of terrorists. That's the typical line. And then sometimes it goes even farther, though I've insisted that I don't want to hear this line anymore unless they really mean it. Sometimes it goes even farther. They say, if you report this, you will have blood on your hands. So that's a typical conversation. And don't think those are easy, because sometimes they're really, really hard. And sometimes they're probably telling the truth, but sometimes it's hard to know whether they're saying it because it'll merely embarrass them, or if they're saying it because it's true. I can think of a couple of instances where I will give you one example, then I'll take more questions on the subject. A really hard one. About 2 or 3 years ago, when I was Washington bureau chief, if you recall, there was an American contractor in Pakistan who got out of his car, was involved in a traffic accident, got out of his car and shot up the car next to him and killed or wounded a couple of Pakistanis. He was immediately he was an American in the middle of an area that was dominated by Pakistanis. There were no Americans there. He was taken into custody. Within 24, 48 hours, we learned that he was a contractor working for the CIA, helping to protect a CIA operation in Pakistan. So we're about to print it. The government calls up and they say, if you publish that this guy works for the CIA, they said, he is in a Pakistani jail. If you publish that he is a CIA operative, he will get killed in that Pakistani jail. Half of the reporters working on the story wanted us to say it anyway. They said that the government can protect him. The argument for running it was it shows how deeply the CIA has infiltrated the world of Pakistan and is on the ground in Pakistan. There were some people who thought it was ridiculous to hold it back. It was already a rumor in Pakistan. We held it back for a couple of days because I bought the possible if he's actually in a jail, and then we used it. But that was hard. Yeah. Oh, one more? So one more question. This is hard. This is an ethical dilemma. The woman with the green scarf. Oh, yes, she's had her hand up long.
Well, it's in reference to these questions. So when you do get these phone calls from the government saying, if you publish this, X, Y, and Z, does that then become part of the story? Do you put that in the story and say we received a call from government? Sometimes
we do. I ask them. I want them to be, I should say, I want these calls. Let's just put the car. I want these calls for one crass reason, and I want these calls for one honorable reason. The crass reason is those calls confirm your story. If the government says, that story that you're a report that says X, Y, and Z happened, please, don't report it. I'm like, okay, we've already crossed one hurdle. It's true. But the other reason, I want to know if it's going to endanger a life. I mean, I really do want to know if it's going to endanger a life. We put it in the story if it's important to the story, or if the readers might wonder if it's clearly. I mean, the last story we ran, well, I shouldn't mention it. Sometimes they ask off the record, and I don't mind letting them ask a question like that off the record, because how else will you get a full-bodied discussion from them where they want to make the case? If they want to make the case that somebody will get killed, I want to hear the full case. That's important. I don't want to learn after the story runs that there was something I didn't know that could get somebody killed. So sometimes we put it in the story if it feels relevant to the story, probably half the time, and sometimes not. Art tells me that's it. One more? Can we have one more? She's been...
That story about the couple days later you decided to put it into paper and then use the CIA.
Yes.
What changed your mind?
What changed my mind was two things. First off, it was his presence in Pakistan was starting to become so hotly debated that it felt like we were holding back a vital piece of information about him and who he was. And it also started to bubble up enough so that it felt like we were being coy by not saying it. And the government was still upset. It's funny, last thing, the image of the New York Times is as the establishment newspaper. The reality is our relationship with the government is extremely tense. I mean, I would say of the last 10 times they raised something with us and asked us not to report something, 9 times we reported it anyway. And only one that I can recall did they actually convince us not to report something. It's a tense relationship. So, thank you. Thank you very much.